Before I begin today's lecture, just let me very quickly point out to you that next week is our midterm test. I know it seems like it's coming up super fast, and indeed it does, and the semester is going to be over with before you know it. But I just wanted to let you know what's coming at you in that regard. But before I do that, I also wanted to respond to, I got a panicked email from one of your classmates saying they went on Blackboard, and Blackboard indicated that everything was due today for this class. Obviously that's wrong. I don't know how that information got on Blackboard. I went on Blackboard, I couldn't find it. But suffice it to say, the due dates are as they're indicated on the syllabus, and you don't have any due dates coming up in the real near future, other than that the midterm is coming up next week. And just to let you know what's coming at you in terms of the midterm is going to take place in this class. It's going to be 1 hour long. We will start the midterm at 15 after, just to make sure that everyone is here and that we don't have that nobody's going to be interrupted by people showing up slightly late. Do try to make sure that you're here on time to avoid any of those problems. But like I said, we'll give you an extra 5 minutes. It consequently will run from 4:15 until 5:15. And to make up for all the times that I've overstayed my welcome in this class previously, there will not be a lecture afterwards. So you will have a bit of a break afterwards between the end of the class and your next classes, or maybe just an early evening for you. The test will consist of 2 essay questions, of which you are required to answer 1. Meaning that you will have some choice in case one of them kind of stumps you to go to the other one. And the nature of the questions I will not discuss too much. Suffice it to say that my aim, and I've so far never been accused of having violated my basic pledge, that when it comes to tests, there should be no surprises. In other words, if you've been keeping up with the lecture material, if you've been keeping up with the readings, and if you ask yourself what kind of a question would I ask if I was trying to gauge the class's overall understanding of this material, chances are you will come up with very similar questions to the one that I'm likely to come up with. And in that sense, there should be no surprises. The thing to keep in mind as far as the test goes is think about the question very carefully. Don't just read it over once and start writing immediately. Think about it. Think about what it is that I'm trying to get you to grapple with. And in most cases, it is generally a good idea to write yourself a brief little outline. That shouldn't take you more than a minute or so of these are the relevant points that I have to hit in order to to completely answer the question. And then follow that outline to make sure that you provide a complete answer. The main reason for that is that on numerous occasions I've had students come up and say, well, you know, I knew all of the stuff that I'm supposed to put down, but I didn't put it down because I didn't read the question carefully and so on. Or that I knew all of the material, but I kind of got sidetracked on one point and didn't get around to all of the other points and ran out of time. That's a problem for you insofar as that I can unfortunately only give you credit for what's on the paper and not just for what's in your head. So make sure that you don't make those kinds of mistakes and needlessly lose points by not reading the question carefully or by not budgeting your time carefully. Not much more that I can say about the test. For the most part, it's going to be pretty straightforward, at least if you've been keeping up with the lectures and the reading material. Let me, before I get into new material, briefly see if there's any quick questions or comments about anything related to the class or anything that we've covered thus far. If not, then let me try to pick up where we left off last class. Last class we began to discuss the Cold War. And I argued, aside from explaining to some extent the emergence. Yep?
No, it was just about the midterm. So there's the 2 questions, answer 1, and that's the whole midterm.
That's it.
No other.
1 essay question. That's it. It's only worth 20% of your grade, so if you kind of mess up, not that I'm suggesting that you should mess up, but if you do, don't panic. There's plenty of time and plenty of scope for improving your grade, but basically that's all that's required. Okay, to get back where we left off. Last class we began to look at the emergence and the nature of the Cold War, and I won't reiterate all of the aspects of the emergence of the Cold War, where we discussed how tensions began to arise in the occupation of Germany, and that it ultimately ended in the partition of Germany, and how that spilled over into other aspects of the growing confrontation between the Soviet Union and its allies, and the United States and its allies. Suffice it to say that as a result of these growing conflicts, two treaty organizations were formed. To begin with, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that incorporated the United States and its Western European allies. And on the other hand, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, or the Warsaw Pact, which constitutes the Soviet Union and its allies primarily in Eastern Europe. Aside from that, there were other alliance systems, in particular in East Asia, where the United States did not form an equivalent to NATO, but instead formed what became known as a hub and spoke system. In other words, bilateral security treaties between the United States and its various allies in East Asia, most notably, of course, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia, New Zealand, and Indonesia also became part of that overall system. Again, as I tried to explain last class, am not trying to provide you with a complete history, either of the emergence of states or the changing state system, or for that matter, the Cold War. What I'm trying to achieve is to draw a broad outline of how the state system that we live in today came into existence and how it evolved over time. And in that regard, looking at the Cold War, again, I cannot give you a complete historical account of the Cold War. That would take far more time than we have available in this course, and there's history courses available to you where you cover that in much more detail, but rather to give you a broad outline of why the Cold War was significant and continues to be significant to this day, and how it changed the overall system of states that we currently continue to live in. In other words, why it is still relevant to this day. In that regard, I'm going to follow your textbook in identifying the main features of the Cold War. And your text basically argues that the Cold War can best and most easily be understood as consisting of four overlapping dimensions. And those dimensions are the ideological dimension, which we discussed at some length last class, which pitted two different ideologies and the social systems organized in accordance to those ideologies against each other, and focused primarily on the ability of those social systems to deliver the goods. In other words, to improve the standards of living and the quality of life of their citizens. And while it is easy to conclude that the Soviet Union lost that battle, that its social system was not as productive as capitalism and did not achieve the aims of its population to the same extent that Western powers did, otherwise it wouldn't have collapsed. I try to demonstrate that this is only partially true. Certainly, the Soviet Union ultimately collapsed, ultimately lost that battle, but it is somewhat shortchanging it to ignore the considerable advances that were achieved under the Soviet system. Advances both in regard to the Soviet economy, its space program, its military programs, its athletics, and so on and so forth. Clearly, however, it was not able to achieve the same standard of living for its citizens that Western countries in Europe achieved. And that, to a large extent, led to its downfall. Continuously throughout the Cold War, the citizens, in particular of Eastern European countries that were well aware of the standards of living that prevailed in Western countries, compared their situation to that of the West, and came to the conclusion eventually that abandoning the Soviet system would give them easy access to a similar standard of living as their Western counterparts. And consequently, once the Soviet Union was no longer able to restrain or to prevent Eastern European countries from breaking away, they all broke away, and the communist governments that controlled them collapsed very quickly, starting with East Germany, then Hungary, Poland, and so on and so forth. In that sense, many in the West immediately declared that this was a victory of the West, that the West had won the Cold War, and had decisively demonstrated the superiority of liberal democracy and capitalism in delivering higher standards of living and quality of life for their citizens. And that certainly is true if we look only at Western Europe and North America. Quite clearly, in that context, capitalist countries outperformed their Eastern counterparts. But in order to understand the continuing relevance of the Cold War, we also have to acknowledge that the same is not entirely true when we look outside of that realm. In other words, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the assumption by many powers, by many, and the most arrogant of those was probably the publication by a prominent political theorist by the name of Francis Fukuyama of his much-cited book, The End of History. Essentially, he claimed that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, history had come to an end, in that liberal democracy stood unchallenged as the best way to organize societies, and while there were still certainly problems around the world that had to be solved, all of those problems would increasingly be solved within that liberal democratic capitalist system. The expectation was that although there were a few communist countries still around, they would very quickly go the way of East Germany and Poland and so on. As most of you know, however, that's not exactly how it worked out. In other words, there are still countries, in particular in the developing world, that cling to the socialist approach to organizing societies. In particular, of course, the one that's most prominent for us is Cuba. Cuba succumbed to a communist revolution in 1959, fell within the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, in part at least because of the hostility of Western powers, in particular the United States, to the Cuban Revolution, and organized its society around similar principles as the Soviet Union. And many expected that the only reason that Cuba survived the hostility of the United States was because it was continuously subsidized by the Soviet Union and protected by the Soviet Union, and therefore many assumed that the Soviet Union gone, the collapse of the Cuban government is only a matter of time. And as most of you know, the Cuban government never collapsed. Fidel and his brother Raul are still firmly in control of the Cuban government. And the question, obviously, is why? And one reason why, I would suggest, is that while East Germany certainly looked across the border at West Germany, and most East Germans came to the conclusion that they would be way better off if they got rid of their Soviet system and adopted Western-style capitalism that would produce a similar standard of living for them as it did in West Germany. And the same goes for Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on and so forth. Well, in Cuba, the relevant comparison was not West Germany. In Cuba, the relevant comparison wasn't even the United States or Florida or something along those lines. The relevant comparison for Cubans was Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Haiti. And these countries, if you compare their level of development to the level of development that prevails in Cuba, the Cuban Revolution looks pretty damn good. In other words, Cubans enjoy free access to healthcare, free access to education, perhaps not a standard of living equivalent to the United States or Canada, but certainly one that is far better for most than the standard of living enjoyed by the average Haitian citizen or the average Guatemalan. It is, of course, true that the elites in Haiti and the elites in Guatemala are much, much better off than their counterparts in Cuba. But the vast majority of the population in those countries lives in abject poverty. And that is a problem that the Cubans, for the most part, solved. And consequently, the Cuban Revolution continued to remain stable and continues to remain stable to this day. And for the same reason, socialism still has considerable appeal, and communism still has considerable appeal in non-Western countries. And as such, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, socialist parties have won elections in various parts of the third world, most notably in Venezuela, which elected a socialist government in 1998. And that socialist government that was elected under the leadership of Hugo Chavez made some pretty impressive gains. Now, you'll read a lot about how Venezuela is a basket case and how Cuba, the government of Chavez was hopelessly corrupt and so on and so forth. But on some statistics, things are pretty clear. Venezuela in 1998 was the most inegalitarian country in all of the Western Hemisphere. And by the time of Hugo Chavez's death in 2013, it had become the most egalitarian country in all of the Western Hemisphere. Meaning that for many Venezuelans, there was a marked improvement in their standard of living. Of course, that marked improvement also was a diminution of the privileges of the ruling elites within Venezuela. And the ruling elites in Venezuela are still very deeply resentful of that democratic revolution and the policies instituted that diminished their privileges within that country. That's an important component of that ideological dimension of the Cold War that still has relevance to this day. And of course, we also know that China continues to function under a communist state, despite the fact that it has adopted considerable components of capitalist styles of development. In other words, it has invited foreign investors, foreign multinational corporations, to invest extensively within their economy in order to develop their economy, to give them access to technology and so on. And in that sense, while there are important aspects of a market economy functioning in China, the government is still under the control of the monopoly of the Communist Party within that state. The same thing goes for Vietnam. Vietnam continues to be governed by a communist government, despite the fact that it has, similar to China, adopted aspects of capitalist development, including welcoming foreign direct investment by multinational corporations. Let me leave the ideological component behind and move on to the geopolitical dimension of the Cold War. In order to understand the geopolitical dimension of the Cold War, we have to understand what is meant by geopolitics. And geopolitics, as the title suggests, combines a study of geography with the study of politics, in particular international politics. And while I don't want to give you a long and detailed explanation of the study of geopolitics, a good way to begin that discussion is simply to highlight two important thinkers that began and still to a large extent frame geopolitical discussions to this day. And those are the two British theorists, Halford Mackinder and Alfred Thayer Mahan. Halford Mackinder basically began to look at the struggle between various great powers, looking at a map of the world. And looking at that map of the world, he came to a fairly straightforward conclusion. The straightforward conclusion that he reached is that the crucial factor in being able to dominate the planet politically and militarily is control over the Eurasian heartland. Control over the Eurasian heartland. Any power that controls the Eurasian heartland is, according to him, ideally situated, and your textbook, by the way, reproduces a really nice map that kind of demonstrates that, is ideally situated to push their influence outward, and thus to ultimately get control of the entire Eurasian continent. And once they get control of the entire Eurasian continent, the rest of the planet is relatively trivial in terms of its importance. In other words, they become the dominant power. And from that point of view, and the United States very much, and its allies very much viewed the planet in accordance to that basic theory, and consequently got rather worried, because the obvious thing about the Cold War is who controlled the Eurasian heartland? Of course, the Soviet Union did. And that gave the West the impression of extreme vulnerability. And indeed, insofar as the history of the 20th century is concerned, it seemed to demonstrate those worries. The communists took over Russia in 1917. The Russian Empire at that point constituted most of the Eurasian heartland. They inherited, in that sense, a multi-ethnic empire, something that was going to be pretty problematic for the Soviet Union and ultimately lead to its downfall. But they were also inherited from their pre-communist counterparts considerable paranoia about their security situation. One of the problems with the Soviet Union and with Russia before that is that it has no natural boundaries that protect it, and thus is very vulnerable to invasions, like the invasion by Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century, and the invasion of Germany during the Nazi era. In both cases, large amounts of Soviet and Russian territory were captured. In that sense, the approach that the Russian government and subsequently the Soviet government always took was that in order to protect its core was to spread its influence outward and create as many buffer states as possible. And this was certainly the approach that was taken by the Soviet Union after its establishment. In the period of the 1930s, they were very keen to set up buffer states between themselves and their more powerful neighbors, in particular in Western Europe, including Poland, which was created as a buffer state at the end of the First World War, and including during the Ribbentrop Ribbentrop Treaty, the brief armistice between Nazi Germany and Russia, essentially a power-sharing arrangement over Eastern Europe in which the Soviet Union gained control over the Baltic states and so on. In other words, the Soviet Union did seem to be expanding. And that was cemented in place at the end of the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, essentially the West recognized a Soviet sphere of influence, which at that point included all of Eastern Europe. The basic attitude taken by the Western powers was that the Soviet Union needed to be contained within that sphere of influence, was not allowed to spread its influence further, because to spread it further would allow it to take over more and more of the Eurasian continent and ultimately make the West indefensible. In particular, of course, they were worried that the Soviet Union would expand into Western Europe, would invade Western Europe, and take control of that region of the world as well. And of course, the Soviet Union appeared to be doing just that. In 1949, it gained a considerable, appeared to gain considerable influence as a result of the Chinese Revolution. And many in the West assumed that the Chinese Revolution was orchestrated by Moscow, and that therefore the Chinese Communist Party was merely a puppet of Moscow. And that gave it a big chunk of the Eurasian continent. Only 2 years later, the North Korean allies of the Soviet Union and the United States invaded the territory of South Korea, attempting to take over all of the South Korean peninsula. Again, that seemed to fit neatly into this idea that the Soviet Union was slowly spreading outward. And of course, the West insisted that this was not allowed to happen, and therefore it launched the Korean War, which pushed the Chinese forces back to the 38th parallel and ended the conflict where it is today, and actually where it more or less began. That same paranoia was further fed by the conflict in Vietnam. In Vietnam, again, it appeared to the West that a communist force under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh was expanding its influence from North Vietnam to take over South Vietnam. And basically, the assumption was that this was a set of dominoes, and thus the domino theory. The domino theory was basically the idea that if one country goes communist, it weakens its neighbors, which then can likely fall to communism as well, and so on and so forth. In other words, the Chinese Revolution led to the takeover of South Korea, which never really happened, but also led to pressures to transform Vietnam into a communist state. And once Vietnam fell to communism, then Laos and Cambodia would, and then Thailand would, and then Indonesia would. And then suddenly all of South and East Asia has gone communist, and the West becomes extremely weak. That was the geopolitical lens through which the West saw the Soviet Union, and one of the reasons why the West was extremely paranoid about the future of Western security and the future expansion of the Soviet Union. However, the Soviets saw the whole thing through a very different lens, and a lens that was much more in keeping with the theories offered by Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan looked at the same facts that Alfred Mackinder looked at, but came to very different conclusions. And those conclusions were essentially that he recognized the importance of the Eurasian heartland, but noted that in the 19th century, if there was one power that dominated most of the planet, which power was that? Anyone remember their 19th century history?
Britain.
Great Britain. Great Britain. And did Great Britain control any part of the Eurasian heartland? Of course not. So how did Britain become a dominant power globally, despite the fact that it didn't control the Eurasian heartland? Well, the conclusion that Alfred Thayer Mahan came to is that it's not the Eurasian heartland that's crucial to controlling the planet, to dominating the planet. What is crucial to dominating the planet is control of the oceans. Control of the oceans allows you to mobilize and to transport troops and forces to any place in the world and makes other states extremely vulnerable. And what is crucial to controlling the ocean is not the Eurasian heartland, but rather the rimlands, the ports and so on, that are located on the edges of the Eurasian heartland and elsewhere around the world. And it is the control of those rimlands that allowed Great Britain to exercise such great control over the planet throughout the 19th century. And put it into a place to spread its influence inward. In other words, through the lens that the Soviet Union looked at the situation during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was in control of the heartland, but was surrounded on all sides by hostile forces. To the south were British and French colonies in South and East Asia. To the west was Western Europe. To the east was Japan. To the north was Canada and the United States. On all sides there were hostile forces. The Soviet Union was surrounded on all sides, and these forces were attempting to press inward to eliminate the Soviet Union. Again, that created an impression on the part of the Soviet Union that it was vulnerable, that it was much more vulnerable than Western countries were to the vagaries of geopolitical forces. Let's leave the geopolitical component of the Cold War at that, and move on to the closely related strategic dimension of the Cold War. And again, these dimensions of the Cold War aren't separate categories, they're overlapping dimensions through which we can understand the conflict that the Cold War represented. The strategic dimension refers to primarily strategic weapons. And by that we mean nuclear weapons, the arms race, the nuclear arms race. The nuclear arms race, of course, began with the explosions of nuclear weapons over Japan. And as we pointed out last class, many historians have argued that the opening salvo in the Cold War was the use of nuclear weapons in Japan, and that the intended audience for that nuclear attack was not the Japanese emperor or the Japanese government, but rather the Soviet Union. The United States was keen to demonstrate the enormous power that it had at its disposal in order to contain and to cow, to some extent, its apparent adversary in the aftermath of the Second World War. The United States, in 1945, as such, had a nuclear monopoly. It was the only country with nuclear weapons. And it perceived itself as needing those nuclear weapons, in particular by virtue of the fact that the fear on the part of the West, a fear that continued throughout the Cold War, was that while the West, the United States in particular, was superior in terms of nuclear weapons and other kinds of weapon systems, it was vulnerable in conventional terms. It was vulnerable in conventional terms because the Soviet Union had a much larger army than the United States did. Had met far more soldiers in uniform, and consequently might attempt to use those soldiers in order to invade Western Europe. And that the United States, therefore, and the Western allies of the United States, therefore needed those nuclear weapons as a deterrent against that possibility, because they would not be able to defend Western Europe on the basis simply of their conventional weapons. Whether that was actually true or not is still hotly debated. It is certainly true that the Soviet Union had more soldiers in uniform in 1945 than did the United States or its allies. But whether those troops were particularly useful after the enormous sacrifices that they had to make in the Second World War, having lost somewhere around 25 million of their citizens, is very much an open question. And most historians are highly doubtful that the Soviet Union had any intention or the capacity to invade Western Europe. They were much more worried about consolidating their own holdings where they stood at the end of the Second World War. Suffice it to say, however, that they were certainly worried about that deterrent capacity of the United States and its allies and the presence of nuclear weapons. And as one might anticipate, got to work very quickly trying to develop their own nuclear capacities. At the time, the United States was, of course, also worried that the Soviets would develop their own nuclear capacities and set their best scientists to work trying to figure out how long it would take the Soviets to do so. And the best estimates they came up with that it would take the Soviet Union at least 20 years because of their technological backwardness and so on. Well, as it turned out, it took the Soviet Union 4 years. In 1949, they exploded their first nuclear weapon, which sent shockwaves through the United States and the West in general, in that the West no longer had that nuclear monopoly, and also set off a witch hunt in the West and the United States in particular to figure out who must have leaked or who may have leaked the secrets to the Soviets. Because since they estimated that it would take them 20 years to figure it out, and it only took them 4 years, somebody must have spilled the beans. and consequently rounded up various people that may have spilled the beans or may have been complicit in providing the Soviets with those secrets. Suffice it to say, it set off an arms race. Now that the Soviets had nuclear missiles, the Americans had to build more. And once the Americans built more and built better nuclear weapons, in 1952 they exploded the first hydrogen bomb. A hydrogen bomb is also a nuclear weapon, but it's a thermonuclear weapon. And what is meant by a thermonuclear weapon is that the nuclear component of that thermonuclear weapon is used not as the main explosive, but rather to create enough heat and pressure to set off a fusion reaction. In other words, to force hydrogen molecules to fuse into more complex molecules, and in the process will release enormous amounts of energy. And essentially, hydrogen bombs are calculated to be roughly 1,000 times more powerful than nuclear weapons. And the majority of the nuclear weapons in the arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union, or Russia today, are hydrogen weapons, not atomic weapons. Suffice it to say that created more incentive for the Soviets to up their nuclear capacities. And the long and the short of that is that by the height of the Cold War, by the end of the Cold War, both sides of the confrontation had enough nuclear weapons to destroy every city on the planet 10 times over. The Soviet Union, at the end of the Cold War, had 39,000 nuclear weapons. The United States was estimated to have roughly 25,000. Far in excess of what would be needed to destroy either of those countries. Now, how would that make any sense? How does it make sense to waste the enormous resources that are required to develop these nuclear weapons, to maintain those nuclear weapons, to build those nuclear weapons, to such an extent that you have enough to destroy every city on the planet 10 times over? Well, on the face of it, it doesn't make much sense, does it? Wouldn't it be better just to build enough to blow up the world and then stop there and not waste your resources and put your resources elsewhere? Perhaps it would. However, what emerged out of this strategic dimension of the Cold War is a system of security, usually referred to as MAD. MAD, not because it was insane, although it certainly was, but rather because MAD stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. Mutually Assured Destruction. And mutually assured destruction rested on a very simple concept. The concept was essentially that in this confrontation, both sides would be safe because neither side could attack the other without the assurance that they would be destroyed in turn. In other words, that if they attacked first, they would be counterattacked and their destruction would be assured. Now, what was required, therefore, for mutually assured destruction to be credible, to be a stabilizing force, was not that a country had enough nuclear weapons to destroy its adversary. That was largely irrelevant. What was important was that a country had enough nuclear weapons left to destroy its adversary after it had already been attacked by its adversary. And how many nuclear weapons would it have left after it had been attacked by its adversary? Well, nobody precisely knows. And consequently, it makes sense to build as many as possible to make sure that you have enough left over after you've been attacked to counterattack. And it's that that guarantees mutually assured destruction. And it's that that makes understandable why the Soviet Union and the United States built 10 times more weapons than were needed to destroy the entire planet. In other words, the second strike capacity was crucial. Now, the other thing that occurred in regard to this is that over time, both sides began to recognize, in particular after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that this was a pretty worrisome situation. In other words, that a nuclear war could start not only because one side decided to preemptively strike against the other, but could start simply as a result of a miscalculation. A miscalculation like what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, basically, the Cuban Revolution took place in 1959. In 1961, the United States tried to reverse it through the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed, but which demonstrated to the Cuban government that the United States was not about to allow a communist government to establish itself in Cuba, and consequently went to the Soviet Union for assistance. And the Soviets said, okay, we'll give you assistance, and we'll give you assistance in the form of nuclear weapons, which we'll station on your island. The reason that the Soviet Union did this is because the Americans had stationed nuclear weapons in Turkey, 20 kilometers from the border of the Soviet Union, that allowed the United States potentially to strike Moscow within 20 minutes with its nuclear missiles. And they were very keen to have some kind of a counterweight to that, the capacity to do the same to the United States. And Cuba seemed like the ideal place to do that, 50 kilometers from Florida. Now, the Americans, of course, once they found out about this, threw a fit and immediately mobilized their forces, immediately blockaded Cuba, and threatened nuclear war. And in response to that, Khrushchev, who was the chairman of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union at the time, basically sent a cable to President Kennedy saying, we will be willing to remove our missiles from Cuba if you in turn remove your missiles from Turkey. And guess what Kennedy did?
He removed his nuclear weapons from Turkey.
No. He said, no way. No way. In large part by virtue of the fact that he was very worried about the reaction of him doing that domestically. For the most part, for those of you familiar with American politics, one of the peculiarities about American politics is that Democrats are always suspected of being weak on national security. And no Democrat wants to play into that game. And if he had simply given up those missiles in Turkey, he would have been accused by his Republicans of selling out the United States and being, well, to use Trump's phrases, bad at bargaining. And things along those lines. So he should have gotten a better deal. He was a loser, or he would have been described as a loser had he simply given in on that. The result of that is a nuclear confrontation that came to within a hair's breadth of an actual nuclear war. Within a hair's breadth in that the Americans imposed an embargo on Cuba, and the Russian ships tried to break through that embargo. And in one of those instances, a Soviet submarine armed with nuclear weapons was under the impression that it was under attack. And its commanders were authorized, independently of communication with Moscow, of firing their missiles. And what was required for them to fire their missile was consensus among all three commanders that the missiles should be fired. Apparently 2 of the commanders gave the go-ahead to fire them, and 1 of them held out. And had that one person not held out, they would have fired their missile, even though they weren't actually under attack. That missile, in all likelihood, would have struck an American city, and you can bet that the Americans would have responded with overwhelming force. In other words, would have fired off all of their missiles at the Soviet Union. And that would have probably been the end of all of us. It didn't happen, basically because one person kept their cool in that situation. And that demonstrated, to a considerable extent, that this was a dangerous situation. The Cuban Missile Crisis was ultimately resolved on the basis of a secret deal reached between Kennedy and Khrushchev, which was never made public until decades later, in which basically Kennedy did just as this gentleman said, agreed to give up the missiles in Turkey. But on condition that this never be made public, and that this will only take place 6 months later. So that he couldn't be blamed for selling out American interests. He never really sold out American interests at all, because those missiles in Turkey were actually scheduled for demobilization even before the Cuban Missile Crisis, because they were obsolete. The United States by that point had shifted to what is today called the triad, the nuclear triad, and the nuclear triad depends on or consists of land-based ballistic missiles that are mostly located in the United States, in missile silos and places in the Middle West. Secondly, air-based nuclear weapons that are permanently stationed on B-52s that fly around the world, and thirdly, submarine-based nuclear missiles. That's the third part of the triad. And the submarine-based nuclear weapons were going to replace those in Turkey, because the ones in Turkey were vulnerable. The Russians knew exactly where they were and could try to take them out. Put those same missiles on a submarine, they're not vulnerable to being eliminated, and can be placed as close to Soviet shores as the Americans want to. In that regard, the missiles were largely irrelevant to begin with. The other part of the deal, apparently, was that the United States promised never to invade Cuba. And of course, it never did invade Cuba, although it certainly would have had the capacity to do so. Now, as I was saying, by the 1960s, in part because of this scary situation, the orientation of both powers began to change. In other words, both sides started to see that this was a dangerous situation and that they had to bring the situation under control. That led, among other things, to policies like the policy of détente that was announced by the late 1960s, in particular under the Nixon administration, in which the Soviet Union and the United States began to negotiate with each other, began to normalize their relations, set up a direct phone line between the White House and the Kremlin, so that if there was a false alarm at some point, or there was any alarm, they could immediately call the leadership of the other side to see whether this was an actual attack or not, and things along those lines. And they also started to get to work on figuring out how to stabilize the situation. And stabilizing that situation rested on the idea that since both sides enjoyed mutually assured destruction, and since that situation was relatively stable, the best thing to do was simply to freeze it at the level where it was. In other words, to limit the expansion of nuclear weapons further. And thus they negotiated a series of strategic arms limitation treaties, SALT as it states over there, that try to limit the further development of nuclear weapons. Probably the most important component of that growing cooperation and attempt to stabilize the situation was another treaty called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, or the ABM Treaty. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty basically committed both sides to refrain from setting up a missile shield to knock down incoming missiles, on the understanding that if either side were able to create a technology capable of knocking down incoming missiles, it would give them a first strike capacity. In other words, it would allow them to protect themselves from the retaliation of the other side had they launched a first strike. The understanding behind that was basically that, neither side could protect themselves against the other side's full nuclear arsenal, given the huge numbers of missiles, but they might have the idea that they could protect themselves against a retaliatory strike if they wiped out most of their missiles first, and thus would have a first strike capacity if they established an anti-ballistic missile system. Essentially, both sides committed themselves to refraining from doing so. All of that changed in the late 1970s and early 80s. In the late 1970s, for reasons I'll discuss in a few minutes when we look at the international dimension of the Cold War. In the early 1980s, in particular, because of the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan in 1982 announced what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative. It was usually called Star Wars instead, because the movie had just come out 3 years earlier, and everyone was nuts on Star Wars, as they are currently with the new edition of Star Wars. Suffice it to say that this announcement of a Strategic Defense Initiative, which was to explore the possibility of developing a system to knock down missiles, was a clear violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And the Soviets immediately cried foul. And the Reagan administration answered, well, no, it's not a violation of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, because the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty merely prevents both sides from deploying an anti-ballistic missile system. It doesn't say anything about developing one. And all we're doing is developing research to develop such a nuclear missile shield. And furthermore, he said, the Soviets don't need to worry, because if we do develop that technology, we'd be happy to share it with them, so we can both be safer. Well, the Soviets didn't buy that. And consequently, the strategic arms limitation treaties basically evaporated. And the Soviet Union, as the only way of countering that, decided that the best strategy to counter an emerging anti-ballistic missile system was to build as many missiles as possible. And consequently, by the end of the Cold War, the Soviets had 39,000 nuclear missiles, about 14,000 more than the Americans. Basically, on the assumption that the best way to counter a possible anti-ballistic missile system was simply to overwhelm it with more and more missiles. And that's essentially where the strategic dimension of the Cold War ended. It's interesting also to note in this regard that the United States, in the United States itself, one of the first things that happened when Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative is that all the journalists ran to the various experts, scientists and so on in universities and asked, is this a pipe dream or is this actually something that's possible? And overwhelmingly the answer among scientists and experts was this was a complete pipe dream. That the idea of being able to knock down thousands of incoming missiles simultaneously with some kind of a defensive system was simply unthinkable. That was the consensus in 1982. Within 6 months, that consensus completely broke down. And it didn't break down because they suddenly realized that it wasn't so far-fetched. It completely broke down because they suddenly realized that insofar as this program was going to get funding, that funding was going to go to the universities that did this kind of research, and therefore to the scientists. And that by denouncing the system, they had basically cut themselves off from all this research funding. And probably their deans and presidents of their universities at MIT and Caltech and so on and so forth sat their experts down and said, "You've got to learn to shut up when you're asked these kinds of questions because it's hurting our funding," demonstrating to some extent that there is within the United States and elsewhere as well what President Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. In other words, a complex of interests, of coinciding interests between the Pentagon, the private sector companies that produce these kinds of weapons systems, and their representatives in Congress, all of which have an interest in increasing funding for these kinds of operations, whether they actually make military sense or not. Let's leave the strategic dimension of the Cold War at that and turn briefly to what your textbook calls the international dimension of the Cold War. The most important term to remember with regard to the strategic dimension of the Cold War is the term deterrence. Deterrence. Essentially, nuclear weapons were intended to deter the adversary on both sides from taking any aggressive actions. The most important term to remember with regard to the international dimension of the Cold War is containment. Containment. Basically, from the Western perspective, and I suspect, as I suggested in our discussion of geopolitics, from the Soviet perspective as well, both sides were paranoid about maintaining the balance between the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies. And the image that prevailed was one of a delicate balance. Both sides were powerful enough to eliminate the possibility of either side attacking each other, but that balance was pretty delicate. In other words, any disruption of that balance that tilted in favor of one side could become irrevocable, could become irreversible. And therefore, no alteration in that balance could be tolerated. The upshot of that is that in the international dimension, the Cold War was anything but cold. In other words, the Cold War remained cold and is called the Cold War because the missiles never flew and no shots were ever fired between the Soviet Union and the United States or their respective allies in Europe. But in other parts of the world, it remained anything but cold. It became a rather hot war. And that, to a large extent, has to do with the political situation in much of the rest of the world, and what became known as the Third World. The First World were the Western countries, the Second World were the Soviet bloc, and the Third World were the countries of the global South. And the one thing that the countries of the Third World all had in common, or mostly had in common, was that they were all colonies of Western powers. And one of the unique things about that overall system, or that situation, is that all of the colonial powers that dominated the Third World were part of the Western Alliance. And of course, as you can imagine, large portions of the population of those colonized countries were highly resentful of their being colonized and being exploited by European countries. And that put the West in a rather weak position. Basically, after the Second World War, after the Europeans unambiguously demonstrated that their civilization was no more civilized than any other part of the world, nicely summed up by Gandhi, who was asked during the period of Indian independence what he thought about Western civilization. And he said, it's a good idea, it should be tried sometime. In other words, he didn't consider the West to be particularly civilized. Well, basically, in the self-destruction of the Europeans during the Second World War, they had lost all credibility toward being better able to manage, let alone civilize, other parts of the world, and consequently, much of the rest of the world insisted on their independence. And the movements that pushed for independence were those that were hostile to Western powers. And for the most part, the Soviet Union saw itself and tried to portray itself as the champion of the struggle against imperialism and colonialism, and therefore backed these anti-colonial forces. And that, in turn, made the West extremely paranoid about its prospects. As I already suggested in our discussion of geopolitics, the basic idea was that any disruption of that balance would irrevocably tilt the situation in favor of the Soviet Union, at least from the Western perspective. And that meant, essentially, that Western powers increasingly threw their support behind the former colonial governments and tried to maintain their colonies, or tried to create puppet governments that were nominally independent, but really continued the relationship with the West that had prevailed previously. Whereas the Soviet Union threw its support behind anti-colonial movements. And that had some important implications. In particular, it made the Soviet Union appear to be the champion of those countries dominated by the West, and that has some lasting implications. One of the best symbols of that is, does anyone here know what the flag of Mozambique looks like? Yep.
It has a on the side, and it's like a
That's
triangle
right.
on the left.
A prominent feature of the flag, the most prominent feature of the flag, is that what you were going to say, Drew? Is the AK-47. The AK-47. Now, the AK-47 is a gun, a submachine gun, that was developed in 1947 by Kalashnikov, thus AK and 47. It has never been altered in its design, and is to this day considered, for the most part, the most reliable and best weapon on the planet. The reason for that is that it's so enormously practical. It's so practical precisely because it's relatively primitive. And its primitive nature, the fact that it's not precision made and so on and so forth, means that you can drop the gun into a puddle of mud and pick it up and it will still fire. You can drop it into a pile of sand and it will still fire. Things that would cripple most other kinds of weapons and clog up all their gears. Now, the Soviets were big promoters of this gun, but they were not a capitalist entity. And consequently, they never put a patent on this gun. And in fact, not only did they put a patent on it, they published the designs for it and encouraged countries around the world struggling against the West to duplicate them. And that means that AK-47s are still being built in Russia, but they're being built in all sorts of places around the world today in accordance to those designs. Some in Africa, some in parts of Central and South America, some in South and East Asia, and so on. It has become the weapon of choice in civil wars, and was certainly the weapon of choice for the independence movements in various parts of the Third World, in particular in Africa. What all of that boils down to is that the international dimension of the Cold War, the attempts to contain Soviet influence, boiled down into a series of proxy wars. Proxy wars in which neither of the superpowers became directly involved, but they were certainly indirectly involved. Vietnam does not quite constitute such a proxy war, because in Vietnam, the United States did get directly involved. However, the Soviet Union didn't. The Soviet Union merely supplied weapons and gave logistical support to the North Vietnamese side. However, in many other places, these proxy wars took on some pretty bloody forms, in particular in regions of Africa. Africa was undergoing, throughout the 1950s and 60s, that wave of decolonization, which replaced white minority governments, colonial governments, with black majority elected governments. One of the last places to hold out in that regard was South Africa. South Africa established its apartheid system to a large extent as a response to this decolonization, and to pretend that they were in fact a white majority government, not a white minority government. Apartheid basically meant that the South Africans granted independence to their black majority by forcing them into homelands, into Bantustans, and then giving those Bantustans independence, self-government. Those Bantustans, those homelands, generally were on useless pieces of land with high concentrations of populations that couldn't possibly function within those boundaries, and therefore still had to go to work in South Africa, working in the mines of South Africa, the factories of South Africa, and so on. In other words, it was largely a sham. It was easily recognized as such and was therefore denounced around the world. Suffice it to say, however, as more and more countries in Africa gained their independence, the South African elites became more and more worried that their days were numbered, and consequently resisted that as much as possible. And they also did so by portraying themselves as a reliable ally of the West in the Cold War. And for the most part, the United States and Canada bought into that. Canada, along with the United States, supported the apartheid government to the bitter end. The United States to such an extent that the leader of the African National Congress that fought against the apartheid government from the 1960s onward, Nelson Mandela, was declared, along with the ANC, a terrorist organization, and remained on the list of terrorists that would not be admitted to the United States for 6 years after he became president of South Africa, and had to get a special dispensation to allow him to travel to address the United Nations as a president of South Africa in the early part of the last decade. In that regard, certainly the Cold War had some major implications. Probably one of the best illustrations of that dynamic is to make use of the example of Angola. Angola was a Portuguese colony, and the Portuguese hung on to their colonies until the bitter end, in large part because Portugal itself was governed by a dictatorship, a nationalist dictatorship, very much tied to maintaining Portuguese power. But that dictatorship, for various complex reasons, collapsed in 1975. And the collapse of that dictatorship in Portugal weakened the colonial governments in Angola, Mozambique, and East Timor, the main possessions of the Portuguese, and led to their independence more or less overnight. And the forces that took control in East Timor and in Mozambique and Angola were the forces that had battled against the Portuguese, and they were the forces that were backed by the Soviet Union. Thus the AK-47 on the map of Mozambique, pardon me, on the flag of Mozambique. Well, in Angola, the situation became pretty interesting. Angola is one of the biggest oil producers in Africa. And under the colonial administration of Portugal, they sought to develop those oil holdings in Angola. But of course, Angola itself doesn't have the technology to do so, and neither did Portugal, and therefore they invited the big oil companies to come in and develop the oil in Angola, which meant Chevron, Exxon, Shell Oil, and so on and so forth. Well, once the colonial government collapsed, the new government was certainly keen on maintaining access to those resources. That was their main source of income, and consequently quickly reached agreements with the oil companies to respect their investments, to allow them to continue to function in order to provide the state with the funds that they needed to operate. Now, the Americans, and in particular the South Africans, were very keen to reverse that situation, to get the Soviet-backed government out. How do you do that? Well, to make a long story short, the South Africans and the Americans got together and started to fund and train and arm and supply a guerrilla force, an insurgency called UNITA, which stands for the Union for the Total Independence of Angola, under the leadership of a fellow by the name of Jonas Savimbi, to try to overthrow the government in Angola. And that military force, that insurgency, was relatively weak. It had little or no support in the domestic population. It was fairly transparent that they were acting on behalf of the former colonizers of South Africa, and consequently never actually attacked the military of Angola, but instead attacked infrastructure, and in particular attacked the industries that were required for the Angolan government to function. And the most important of those were, of course, the oil installations. And if you think about that for a moment, it means that a militia, established, organized, supported, funded, and trained by the United States, was attacking oil installations owned by big American companies. That's kind of bizarre, isn't it? Now, what's even more bizarre is that, of course, the Angolans wanted to defend themselves against that. And anyone know what the Angolans did to defend themselves against that? They sought help from elsewhere. Their soldiers weren't strong enough to defend the installations, and does anyone know what country came to their aid? Cuba. Cuba sent 10,000 soldiers to defend Angola. which basically meant that Cuban soldiers were guarding American installations, American oil installations, against attacks that were being funded by the American government. Now, if that's not bizarre and ironic, I don't know what is. But that was the bizarre nature of the Cold War. And of course, as I pointed out, in the third world, for the most part, the United States was not, in general, on the winning side of most of those conflicts. As such, similar situations arose in East Timor, in Nicaragua, which overthrew an American-backed government in 1979, in Angola, and of course eventually also in South Africa, but that was after the Cold War was over. To end our discussion of the Cold War, it is also important for us to note that the United States eventually, and its allies, eventually abandoned the policy of containment. They abandoned the policy of containment basically in the late 1970s during the Carter administration, largely as a result of the advice offered to the Carter administration by his national security advisor, a fellow by the name of Zbigniew Brzezinski. Brzezinski argued that the best strategy for the United States was to present the Soviet Union with its own Vietnam. In other words, to draw the Soviet Union into a war that they could not win, and that would bankrupt their system, just as Vietnam had come pretty damn close to bankrupting the United States. The United States in the Vietnam War dropped more bombs on Vietnam than were dropped on all combatants in World War II combined, and still lost the war. And was aware that it was losing the war, and then therefore assumed that the reason it was losing the war was because the sneaky communists were infiltrating from Laos and Cambodia, and then dropped more bombs on Laos and Cambodia than were dropped on all combatants in World War II combined, despite the fact that they weren't at war with either of those countries, and still lost the war. And all of that, of course, cost a lot of money. Well, speaking of Brzezinski, argued, let's draw the Soviets into the same kind of a conflict, and let's do so by trying to undermine one of the governments that they're backing. And of course, most of you are aware that the government I'm referring to was the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan, which was secular largely, and consequently did not have a great deal of support from the Afghani population, which was overwhelmingly agrarian, relatively undeveloped, and deeply religious. Consequently, the idea of Brzezinski, which was later carried on and accelerated by Ronald Reagan, was to use that deep religious conviction of the population of Afghanistan as a counterweight to the secular policies of the Afghani government. In other words, they started to train and arm Islamic fundamentalists, jihadists, to take up jihad against the Soviet Union. And these groups became known as the Mujahideen. And one of their most prominent leaders, as most of you are probably aware, was Osama bin Laden, who later became the leader of Al-Qaeda. These forces basically attacked Soviet installations in Afghanistan in an attempt to draw the Afghanis into invading the territory, which the Soviets, which the Soviet Union did in 1979. And it basically battled against the Mujahideen from 1979 until it eventually withdrew its forces in 1988, and the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan collapsed, which led to an extensive civil war and eventually the victory of the Taliban within Afghanistan. Many argue that this was a crucial blow that brought about the end of the Soviet Union. But let's look at the collapse of the Soviet Union in a bit more detail. There are a number of different explanations for why the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991. Among them are domestic reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the 1970s, most historians agree the Soviet economy was stagnating. It was stagnating in part because of the enormous expense of keeping up an expensive arms race with the West, but also by virtue of the fact that the nature of the economic system in the Soviet Union made it unresponsive to the needs of the public. The Soviet Union didn't have a market system that allowed the Soviet leadership to gauge what kind of things were in demand and what kind of things were not. Consequently, they had to decide on the abstract what they thought the Soviet citizens might need, how many clothes, how many shoes, and so on and so forth, and would produce what they thought the Soviet population would want. The upshot of that is that the conventional wisdom in the Soviet Union was that the Soviet Union that the population of the Soviet Union was very conscious of what was in fashion. All they had to do was walk into stores, and anything they saw on the shelf was not in fashion, meaning they were all outdated styles and so on and so forth. In other words, there was growing frustration with the standard of living, with the quality of life within the Soviet Union itself. And Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader that came to power in 1982 in the Soviet Union, sought to address that problem by initiating two programs. One is called Perestroika, which refers to opening the political system to allow more competition within the political system and to undermine the monopoly that the Communist Party had on power. The other was Glasnost, which referred to economic opening. In other words, creating some room for private enterprise and for markets to emerge to become more responsive to the needs of the Soviet Union, the Soviet population. The upshot of that is that many considered that what he did in the process was open up the Soviet Union to a set of forces that he ultimately was unable to contain. And that as these openings progressed, ultimately they undermined the ability of the Communist Party to maintain itself in power and resulted in Gorbachev being overthrown in a coup in 1991 by Boris Yeltsin and the forces backing him. Another possible explanation is simply imperial overstretch. In other words, that the Soviet Union, in taking on all of these commitments from the southern tip of Africa to Cuba and so on and so forth, simply took on more than it could sustain. And that in that regard, as Paul Kennedy in his book, The Rise and Fall of Empires, argued, fell victim to what the Roman Empire, the British Empire, most empires throughout history have fallen victim to. Which is that empires are naturally inclined toward expanding, but as they expand, their supply lines become more and more distant, and they tend to hollow out at the center. In other words, they overexploit their resources at the center, and as that begins to happen, they have a harder and harder time maintaining their commitments and eventually disintegrate. So that's one explanation. Another is that the arms race ultimately bankrupted the Soviet Union. The arms races, in particular those launched by Ronald Reagan in the Strategic Defense Initiative, that forced the Soviet Union to devote more and more money toward increasing their stockpile of nuclear weapons, and that ultimately bankrupted them. Mikhail Gorbachev himself argues that while all of these factors played somewhat of a role, they were relatively insignificant. Mikhail Gorbachev argues that what sank the Soviet Union ultimately was the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl. And that might seem a little surprising. We don't generally tend to think of a nuclear disaster as bringing down an empire, but it makes considerable sense. By the time that the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl melted down, I think it was 1988, the Soviet Union had already overtaxed its military capacities in Afghanistan for over a decade. And when that nuclear meltdown took place, basically they had to contain it somehow. And containing it was extremely difficult, just as it was and continues to be difficult in Fukushima, which interestingly has disappeared from the news headlines, even though it is very, very much an ongoing nuclear disaster. Well, the only way to contain it was to clean it up. The problem with cleaning it up is that no machinery would function within the area of the nuclear reactor because the radiation levels were too high. It screwed up all the electronics, so you couldn't use bulldozers. The only thing you could use was individual people with shovels. And that meant that they had to send large numbers of people with shovels in to clean up the mess. And the problem with that was that they would, within 10 minutes, receive their maximum lifetime exposure to radiation. In other words, they had to run in there with their shovels, shovel for 10 minutes, and then get the hell out, and then come down with radiation sickness and so on and so forth. Basically, that meant that the Soviet Union used its entire military, somewhere around 700,000 soldiers, that were ordered to march in there to clean up the mess that was left by Chernobyl. And that in turn meant that by the time that there were upheavals in Poland, in East Germany, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, aiming toward independence from the Soviet Union simply did not have any means of putting down those rebellions. And consequently, Eastern Europe fell apart, and subsequently the entire Eastern Eastern European series of states that were governed by the Soviet Union and its backed governments likewise succumbed to various kinds of revolutions. Was this a triumph of democracy in the markets? Well, that's something that we'll have to take up. what I want to do at this point is to move on to our next major topic. But before I do that, let me briefly point to a couple of things about the continuing relevance. Just a second, let me get to my next set of I thought I had that properly set up, but I guess I did not. Political economy, here we go. Before I get onto our topic of political economy, which I'll only introduce today, just wanted to say a couple of more things about the continuing relevance of the Cold War. We already talked about the continuing relevance of the ideological appeal of socialism in various parts around the world, so I won't belabor that point. However, there are a couple of things that are certainly still relevant to this day, one of which is that in terms of the strategic dimension of the Cold War, while the number of nuclear weapons that are possessed by the United States and the Soviet Union have decreased phenomenally over the last few years, over the last couple of decades, both the Soviet Union and the United States today continue to possess about 3,000 nuclear warheads, meaning that they are still very well equipped to destroy life on this planet if they choose to do so, or if a war emerges between them. And in that regard, there is continuing relevance of the Cold War confrontation as a result of these nuclear weapons. Mr. Obama, of course, announced at the beginning of his presidency his aim to rid the world of nuclear weapons, and won a rather premature Nobel Peace Prize for doing so. He has reduced, during his presidency, the number of nuclear weapons possessed by the United States down to that 3,000 level. However, did so with considerable opposition from, in particular, Republicans in the United States, and consequently did that on the basis of a deal that spelled out that essentially most of those nuclear weapons that the United States had were obsolete, were old, were aging, were no longer all that functional, and that therefore the United States had to consolidate its nuclear forces by modernizing them. In other words, just last year, he agreed with Congress to a modernization of the American nuclear arsenal to the tune of $1 trillion to be spent on it between today and 2030. And that modernization was going to transform the nuclear arsenal away from the intercontinental ballistic missiles and so on and so forth toward developing various other kinds of nuclear weapons, in particular bunker busting missiles with a much smaller yield, but consequently much more usable. And as a result of that, many have argued that the United States, far from making nuclear war less likely, has made it much easier to cross the nuclear umbrella. One of the things that prevented either side from ever using nuclear weapons after the initial use in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was essentially that they were useless in war. They were useful only as deterrent weapons because their destructive capacity was so enormous that it simply didn't make any sense to use them. Well, if you shrink them down more and more into battlefield weapons, into bunker busting missiles and so on and so forth, then using them becomes much more rational. And in that case, you cross the nuclear threshold, which makes it very difficult then to prevent others from doing so as well, and thus makes a nuclear conflagration all the more likely. In terms of the geostrategic dimension of the Cold War, what I should mention is that that is also still very much relevant. The United States, for the most part, took the lessons of Alfred Thayer Mahan to heart, in that they rested their security strategies primarily on their ability to control the oceans. And that was certainly well established throughout the Cold War and continues to be the case to this day. The United States unambiguously controls the oceans of the world. It has a series of aircraft carrier fleets that can be moved around the planet and they can project power into any corner of the globe. On that score, they are still largely unchecked by any other force. Interestingly, however, the Chinese, that are now the main potential challenger to the United States in terms of its dominance, have focused more on the notion of the heartland, and have done so in particular through their attempts to reestablish what they call the Silk Road. In other words, the trade routes through Central Asia that connect Western Europe to China. That used to be based on camel trains that were sent packing silk and so on and so forth to Western European markets, Their modern incarnation is the extensive building of rail networks that would allow extensive transportation of goods from China directly to Europe. And indeed, those are already well developed to such an extent that you can get goods from China to Western Europe in half the time using that train network that it would take to send them by sea. And that makes the sea control that the United States has to a large extent irrelevant. And consequently, the Chinese are very much trying to integrate the Eurasian continent on the basis of this new Silk Road. And not surprisingly, the Americans are doing their very best to prevent that from actually happening. And the way that they're preventing that from happening is essentially to separate Western Europe from Eurasia. And one means of doing that is to create animosities between Russia and Europe, and thus the conflict in Ukraine plays into that. The other way of doing that is to negotiate various free trade pacts as an alternative to the Eurasian combined market, the free market from Vladivostok to Lisbon, as the Russians and the Chinese try to advocate. And how have they done that? Well, there's two trade agreements that are currently being negotiated. One is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the other is the Transatlantic Alliance. The Trans-Pacific Partnership includes all of the Pacific powers along the Eurasian continent, as well as Latin America, but excludes China. Basically, it's separating China from the other countries in East Asia. The Trans-European Partnership or Alliance would create a free trade agreement between the European Union and the United States. And thus, the attempt is to leave Russia and China to their own devices, and thus separate them from their most lucrative markets and so on. Again, in that sense, geopolitics is still very much with us. Now, let me leave the Cold War at that. We will return to that in a couple of lectures when we look at conflict since the Cold War and how that continues to be shaped to some extent by the leftovers of the Cold War, and begin by introducing the topic of international and political economy. I will not get very far in that, so don't get worried. I will let you out a little bit early. Don't get too antsy. But a good place to start a discussion of international political economy and the relevance of understanding economics to understanding international politics is to start where Robert Heilbroner, a very influential economist from the United States, began his book on the history of economic thought called The Worldly Philosophers. If you're interested in it, I highly recommend that as a great source. And there he asked a basic question, why there were no economists prior to Adam Smith? Why there were no economists prior to Adam Smith? Adam Smith is generally considered to be the first economist as a result of the publication of his most influential book, which was entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which has formed the foundation and continues to be read by economists to this day. Why were there no economists prior to his time? Certainly economies have been around for an awful long time. Well, actually, there were a few economists, but they weren't worth speaking of, and consequently, the field of economics doesn't pay a great deal of attention to them. In particular, one fellow by the name of John Law, who I believe was also a Scot, like Adam Smith, wrote a few decades before Adam Smith, and came up with a theory of money. And his theory of money is that money is an absolute crucial ingredient to any development of any kind of an economy, because without money, you have to barter. And barter is inherently an inefficient system by virtue of the fact that it means that if you're trying to sell something, you have to find somebody that wants precisely that thing and that also has something that you want. Money obviously makes that a lot easier because all you do is exchange money and then you can buy with that money whatever the heck you want. Barter is not a very efficient system. Now, money has usually taken the form of gold. In traditional times, directly, that most coins were made of gold and therefore had inherent value, or silver for that matter, and had inherent value. But he came up with the idea that it was the inherent value of the gold and the silver that gave that money its value and therefore made a medium of exchange. And that if the value of the gold and not the gold itself was the result of, or resulted in it being a good medium of exchange, then states could use other means of backing the value of their money and could print paper money and simply back the value of that money with other assets. and basically convinced the French that they could vastly increase their money supply, and therefore the money that they had available, by backing their currency with other assets. And in particular, the asset that he convinced them was most useful in that regard was land. The land in France itself was, of course, mostly in private hands, owned by individuals, so the state couldn't use that to back the currency. But the French had enormous possessions in North America, in particular in what became the Louisiana territory that was handed to the Americans as a result of the Louisiana Purchase, basically the entire middle west of the United States. And essentially convinced them to print up money on the basis of backing it by so and so many acres of land in the Americas. The problem with that is that the land in the Americas really didn't have much value. It was mostly swampland that was undeveloped, and consequently all he did was fuel an enormous process of inflation in France, which led to disaster, which led to him eventually being arrested and thrown in jail. And not surprisingly, economists don't want to remember that as the beginning of their discipline. Adam Smith was different. Adam Smith asked the basic question in his book, The Nature and the Causes of the Wealth of Nations, of what makes a country wealthy and what makes other countries poor. And to begin with, he came up with some pretty radical answers. He was an extreme radical in his time that rejected almost all of the conventional wisdoms that prevailed at the time. The conventional wisdoms that prevailed at the time was that rich countries versus poor countries is no mystery. The country that has the most gold in their treasury is a rich country. The country that has the least gold or no gold is a poor country. The purpose of economics, the purpose of trade and so on, is to mass as much gold as possible. And Adam Smith simply said, that's nonsense. How much of a trivial metal a country has in its, stored somewhere in its basement of its palace, has nothing to do with the wealth of nations. The wealth of nations, as he defined it, is determined by how much a country can produce and therefore how much it can consume. That is the wealth of nations, not how much gold is stored in its treasury. And that definition of wealth is still very much with us. It is still very much with us in that this is precisely how we gauge economies to this day. And we gauge the performance of individual economies on the basis of a statistic usually referred to as the GDP or the GNP. GNP stands for gross national product, GDP stands for gross domestic product. The difference between the two is trivial for our purposes. One includes the product of foreign investment, the other does not. We don't have to worry about that. You can worry about that in your economics classes if you go on to study economics. Suffice it to say, however, that this measure is used essentially to gauge whether a country is a developed country or an underdeveloped country. Countries that have a per capita GDP of $5,000 or more are generally considered developed countries. Countries like Canada, the United States, Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, and so on and so forth. Countries that have a per capita GDP somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 are seen as developing countries, countries like Brazil, Mexico, and so on and so forth. And those that have a per capita GDP below 2,000 are generally seen as the least developed countries. In that sense, that is the central measure of the wealth of nations, no longer how much gold may be stored in their treasuries. And there's something kind of unique about that, in that whether the GDP is an accurate measure of the wealth of nations is still, or how well an economy is doing, is still very much debatable. The other thing that we use the GDP for is to gauge how well an economy is doing at a particular moment in time. And we gauge that on the basis of the growth of GDP. If a country is growing in excess of 3% per year in terms of its GDP, it's generally seen as doing well. If it grows somewhere between 0 and 3% of the GDP, it's generally considered to be in recession or to be weak. If it's contracting, in other words, it's shrinking, it's generally considered to be, especially if it does so for a long period of time, to be in a depression. So essentially, these are important measures. But do they actually measure the right thing? And this is something that's very much debated. So, for example, a good illustration of that is that a couple of years ago, well, to make that a little bit easier to understand, the GDP and the GNP are a measure of all the goods and services exchanged within an economy. All the goods and services exchanged within an economy. That's all they measure. Every time somebody hands over $1 to somebody else to buy a pack of gum, that is calculated into the GDP. If they build a factory, it's calculated into the GDP. All of that involves exchanges of money. Really, the GDP is a measure of how much money is exchanged for the purpose of goods and services. Now, to demonstrate how that is somewhat problematic, a couple of years ago, the eastern seaboard was hit with an enormous hurricane, Hurricane Sandy, that wiped out a large part of New Jersey, a major part of New York City, parts of Connecticut and Massachusetts, and so on and so forth. Did the GDP of those states go up or down as a result of that?
It went up because spending increased to
Exactly. Spending increased. People had to put new roofs on their houses, had to repave streets, had to reestablish beaches and so on. All of that involves exchanging money for services and goods. And therefore, hurricanes are good for the economy. Maybe not. Another good example of that is divorce. Couple lives together happily in a house and has their family, and eventually they don't get along so well together, and they decide to have a divorce. Does that increase or decrease the GDP?
Increase.
It increases the GDP because suddenly they need two houses, not just one. They have to live in separate residences. Furthermore, they don't get along, and therefore they can't agree on how to divide their property, and that means they have to hire lawyers. And that means they're spending an enormous amount of money on lawyers. That increases the GDP. The kids are getting more and more frustrated and worried and depressed, and before you know it, they're sniffing glue and they need counseling, and in other words, drug addiction and divorce and all of that is good for the economy. Well, most of us would think that that's not really the case. And in that sense, it illustrates to some extent why the GDP may not be the best measure of how well an economy is doing, but it very much reflects the philosophy of Adam Smith. So he was radical in terms of how he saw the purpose of an economy and the measure of an economy, but that wasn't really his most important contribution, and not why he's considered the father of modern economics. The answer that he gave to what makes a country wealthy and what makes other countries poor, it comes closer to it. Essentially, within the first couple of pages of that book, he argues that the crucial factor that makes some countries wealthy and other countries poor, does anyone know what the crucial factor is? None of you have studied economics yet. The division of labor. The division of labor. He basically argued that countries in which each household has to produce pretty much everything that they require for their daily existence is likely to be an extremely poor country. They have to grow their own food, they have to build their own houses, they have to make their own clothing, they have to entertain themselves and so on. And given all of those demands, they're not going to be able to generate a great deal of wealth. If, on the other hand, they divide those tasks as a society up among as many people as possible and allow individuals to specialize on those things that they do best, their wealth increases. And he made that argument on the basis of a very famous example. And that very famous example was the example of the pin factory. Essentially, what Adam Smith was doing was writing about what he was observing happening around him, not really inventing anything new. But what he was observing happening around him is nicely summarized by this. Basically, what he did in his studies is he looked at how pins were made traditionally. And pins were traditionally made by blacksmiths. That throughout the Middle Ages in Europe made everything that was made from metal. Blacksmiths, in order to make pins, would have to melt down metal, build a fire, melt down metal, draw that metal out into wires, then clip the wires into small little segments, then sharpen one end of the wire, then put a head onto the other end of the wire. And in watching a very skilled blacksmith do this for a whole day, he calculated that this blacksmith was capable of producing 20 pins in a day. And then he went to a small-scale factory that produced pins in Scotland at the time. And that factory had 10 employees that divided those tasks up. So one person was responsible for maintaining the fire, another person was responsible for melting the metal, another person responsible for drawing out the wire, and so on and so forth. And these 10 people together produced 2,000 pins in a single day. Now you divide that 2,000 by 10, it means that their individual productivity was 10 times what one individual could do on their own. In other words, 200. And he essentially argued that if this is true for an enterprise like a pin factory, it's certainly true for societies as a whole. The more they are able to specialize, the more they are able to develop a division of labor, the more wealthy they are likely to become. And indeed, the British were by that point among the wealthiest countries in the world, and also the ones that had developed the greatest division of labor. So all of that seemed to verify his overall theory. Again, that's a good observation, but not the reason why he's the father of modern economics. It's not his most radical contribution. His most radical contribution is the answer to the question of how do you get there? In other words, how do you establish a greater division of labor? How do you get to a situation where somebody can specialize on doing nothing but attaching a pinhead to a pin, and from doing that, get everything that they require for their daily existence, from housing to clothing to food to entertainment and so on? Well, he argued that in order to do that, you need markets. You need markets. And this is his most important contribution to economics. Now, you might argue, if you've been thinking along with us and thinking critically, wait a second, Adam Smith didn't invent markets. Markets have existed since biblical times. Didn't Jesus smash the markets because he was frustrated at the greed of those that were operating on them and so on? And of course he did. And of course markets have existed throughout history for many millennia. But markets, as they existed in those contexts, were very different from the kinds of markets that Adam Smith was talking about. Essentially, and this gets to the point of why there were no economists prior to Adam Smith, in times prior to Adam Smith's time, basically political power and economic power were one and the same thing. There was no mystery to why some people were powerful and wealthy and why others were not. Wealth and power went hand in hand. That was certainly the case in slave-based societies, and it was certainly the case in feudal societies. Those that controlled politics were the landowners, and the landowners also controlled the economy. And they controlled the economy in very absolute terms. And basically, insofar as there were considerations of economics, they were written about, thought about by moral philosophers. In other words, why something fetched a certain price was not a result of some mystery, as it is today, where we have to figure out demand and supply and all of these kind of things. The reason something cost a particular price on a market was because the political authorities said that that was the price that they could fetch on the market. In other words, markets were controlled by the doctrine of the just price. The just price, in which political authorities set precisely what somebody could charge for a particular good. And they usually did that through a system of guilds, in other words, professional organizations that determined precisely the quality of the various goods that could be sold and precisely what price they should fetch. And Adam Smith basically said, well, it's understandable why individuals think that morality should have something to do with economics and why prices should be determined by morality, but all of that is nonsense. All of that is counterproductive nonsense. Markets should rule themselves. Markets should rule themselves, and those that trade on markets should be able to charge for their goods that they trade on those markets whatever the heck they want. Now, that's a pretty radical statement. And to demonstrate how radical it is, a good illustration is a brief thought experiment. Something like that pin factory example. Imagine a village in Scotland. Scotland has a pretty cold climate, and one of the problems with cold climates is that people that live in cold climates suffer from things like vitamin D deficiency, which because of the lack of sun, but also from vitamin C deficiencies because they can't grow citrus trees and things along those lines. Now imagine that in this village there's one person that has a cranberry bush, a good source of vitamin C. Well, basically, under the just price, he would have had to sell his cranberries, if he wanted to sell them at all, at whatever was deemed the just price. And the just price was determined by what was considered fair to everyone else in his community, what would give everyone else in the community access to that vital resource. Adam Smith said, that's stupid. Let the guy charge whatever he wants. If he wants to charge $100 a cranberry, let him do that. And if his village dies from a vitamin C deficiency as a result of him not being able to pay $100 per cranberry, so be it. Now, is that not outrageous? Is that not completely immoral that somebody should be allowed to hold their entire community hostage to their own selfishness? Well, it certainly appeared that way to many in Adam Smith's time. But Adam Smith had a very good reason for making that argument. He argued essentially that if you allow the person to charge that $100 per cranberry, it's going to be a very short time until his neighbor says, well, wait a second, why can't I grow a cranberry bush? And his neighbor will do the same. And before you know it, the supply of cranberries will go up. And as the supply of cranberries goes up, the ability of one person to charge $100 for cranberries will diminish. In other words, the price of cranberries will go down. And the problem of the deficiency of vitamin C over the medium to long term will have been solved for that village. Whereas if you force it to sell them at a nickel apiece, nobody will ever have an incentive to produce more of them, and consequently the problem will persist forever. Everyone is better off if everyone can act as selfishly as they want, if everyone can do what they think is best for themselves. And through the magic of the market, through what he called the invisible hand of the market, by everyone only looking out for themselves and only doing what they do out of their own selfish greed, through the magic of the market, precisely what needs to be created will be created. What is demanded will have supply. Does that kind of make sense? It's on that basis, of course, that the market became an independent force, became separate from politics, and consequently, that the mysteries that we have about economics have emerged. Why is does the oil price fluctuate the way that it does wildly? Why does your cauliflower suddenly cost $7.99, where it was 3 weeks ago it cost only $2.99, and so on? Those are mysteries that are solved to a large extent by looking at market forces. And this is precisely what economists do. Economics has, in that sense, separated from politics, has become a separate realm. But the relationship between economics and politics is still vitally important to the fate of states. And that's a topic we'll take up next week. And let me leave it at that for this time, and see if there's any quick questions or comments or expressions of outrage and disgust or anything of that sort. Happily there aren't any, so have a great day, and we'll see you all next week.
Me too.